Hello and welcome to A Decade of Decline. What are the implications? My name is Emma Robinson, and I'm the project manager for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. Thank you to our panelists and guests for joining us today, and to the Canadian Corporation for Studies in Religion for co-sponsoring this event. As we begin, please join me for a land acknowledgement. While we gather virtually for this event from places near and far, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today, and acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. The Non-Religion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. Now I will turn things over to Lori Beeman, the principal investigator of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, to introduce today's panelists.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm really excited about this panel. Of course, Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme came a couple of weeks ago and gave us an overview of the new StatsCan data on religion, and we thought it would be really interesting to have a panel where we could discuss a little bit more from a variety of perspectives, how different people are reacting and thinking about this, the latest developments. And so I am delighted to say that we have with us today Stuart Macdonald, who is professor of church and society at Knox College, and his main teaching areas are in the history of main teaching area is in the history of Christianity. And many of you will know him for his work on religion and social change, and most specifically and especially for his book Leaving Christianity, which he wrote with Brian Clark. Alistair Hay has come to the sociology of religion, as he puts it, from the dark side, in his words, having spent about 40 years as a researcher in the private sector. His company, Hay Research International, has extensive experience conducting research for all manner of organizations, including multinationals, nationals, banks, and smaller charities. So his background in philosophy, though, and religion got him thinking about social change and religion, which brought him in contact with us. And we're delighted to say that his company is a partner organization. And then he's been a really terrific collaborator on this project. He said, I want to quote him, he said he's been reading so much on the subject that his wife recently said to him, "What are we going to do with all these books?" So I'm envying you your reading time, Al. Rick Hiemstra is Director of Research and Media Relations at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And Rick comes to this not only in this position, but he has a past that will help him to help us think about these data. He served as a Wesleyan pastor and as a high school mathematics and computer science teacher. So welcome, Rick. Kati Tervo-Niemelä is a professor in practical theology at the University of Eastern Finland. She's an NCF collaborator and has extensive experience with social survey research. She's our external expert here today, and she's looking at what these shifts in religion as measured by StatsCan look like from the outside, and actually in a country not so far from me right now because I'm in Germany. So Kati's coming to us from Finland today or tonight, depending on where you're located. So without further ado, I thought I'd start us off with a question, and I'll go around to give each person an opportunity to respond. But also, I'm happy for you to exchange. If we were in the same room together, you'd be able to do that. And I realize it's sometimes a little bit awkward by Zoom, but every once in a while we can pull that off. So I want to encourage you, if you have something to say to each other, I'll try to pick up on that signal. But let's start with the question, what surprised you about the StatsCan data on religion? And maybe we'll start with Al on this one. Al, what surprised you?
Well, Lori, thank you for the invitation. I was very surprised. And I think the major thing, of course, which I think we've all seen, is the rise of no religion. And also the drops in affiliation with Christianity, and these were sizable. I think we've talked that before, But being a sort of a research numbers guy, I've tumbled through things a little bit, and there's a few other things that come out. One is the speed of the rise of no religion. So when we look at the generation, at least the decade from 2001, 2011, we're looking at declines of about 0.7 points, so 7 points over the 10-year span. But recently, in the most recent decade, that's moved up to 1.1%. So are we looking at an acceleration in these patterns? The question is why. I'm sure we could think of some answers, and perhaps we could just throw that out, but I want to just make that point. Things are increasing in this decade. The other thing that I'm sure Stuart will talk to is the declines in the affiliation rates for specific Protestant denominations. These were not moving, these were moving down faster than for the Catholic Church, for example. And quite surprising, actually, when you look at the numbers, the declines in 10 years are about 40% based on those overall share numbers. So something going on there. Silver lining, other religion category is moving up. And that could be substantially, Catholic or Protestant, but it could be substantially Protestant. So what I'm taking from this, just as an outsider looking in, is that we've got a loss of particulars, something about the specifics of the denomination are being lost a little bit. And that raises some questions. And I say a little bit, it's a little stronger than that. So patterns are a little alarming there. So those are the three basic things that I took from the results. I'm sure there are lots more that others can speak to. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Those are really interesting observations. So we're going to keep going and put them together with other people's observations and see where we end up. Rick, maybe I could come to you next and just ask you what surprised you?
I don't know that there's so much that I was surprised, but interested. As Al mentioned, there's this rise in kind of the other Christian category. And I suspect that were we to have a code book, and StatCan used to produce code books, which was basically instructions to those that were tabulating surveys or the census about how they put people into bins on the census. Were we to have that, we would know who they were putting into that other category. So, I've had some conversation with Jared Dobson at StatCan, and they do have a spreadsheet which is suggestive of what that code book would look like, but I've been cautioned not to use that as a code book. That said, I think that, given my specialty is evangelical churches, and given the climate that we're in and the representations of evangelicals in the media, I think that there is a backing away from that term and identifying with that term, but not just with the term, but with the subcategories that go along with that. So it was noted that there's some declines in Pentecostal and Baptist. These are the two terms that were the evangelical terms that were retained in the question. But overall, you see a pattern within evangelicalism to rename churches. Instead of being First Baptist Church, they might be a community church, this kind of community church, that kind of community church. And so the comparability to older census is sort of being compromised a little bit by what's going on in the culture right now. And so I hope that StatCan makes a code book available, but as of yet, they have not.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Kati, as the viewer from outside, what are you seeing?
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you everybody who has joined us today. Well, if I think of myself and what surprised me, I could perhaps say that I was not primarily surprised. I was primarily delighted. And that is not because of the situation as such, but I was delighted from that perspective that we collected a year ago, 2021, we collected data from 5 countries, from 4 European countries and from Canada. And we have 1,500 telephone interviews from Canada. And in that data, we had 39% of our respondents were non-religious, sort of religious nuns. And we were told by the polling agency and also from some reviewers as well that our data from Canada is highly sort of overrepresented, that the non-religious are highly overrepresented in our data. But after hearing from Sarah 2 weeks ago, it was sort of nice to see that our 39% is actually quite close to that 35% that Sarah presented. So it was really inspiring to hear from Sarah also from that perspective, and also to that sort of inspired me to look at our data as well from that perspective, that wow, it seems that our non-religious are actually there in Canada as they are in our data. So I could perhaps, if there is time during this discussion today, to show some figures from our data, which might make it some additional information to that what Sarah told us 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's good. It's always good to have another, to know that you're triangulating and that things are, your data are accurate as well. So that's good. And I don't think it actually would come as a surprise. I mean, I think, Rick, you've been involved in some work too that would suggest that this is not out of range. Stuart, last but certainly not least, what surprised you?
The velocity, that's it. The speed of change. These are trends that I think were pretty clearly established. They've become in sharper focus. I think what we really saw as a sharper focus was what some of us were thinking already. And so it was the speed of change, particularly in no religion, which was the one thing that really surprised me. But these are trends it's just confirmation for me of what we've been seeing.
Yeah, certainly you predicted, I mean, we finally saw that drop in Quebec. The 20-point drop, which was to me shocking, and you predicted that, I think, in Leaving Christianity.
Brian predicted that. My
Census co-author. You can take credit.
I'll give credit where credit's due. But I think we were looking at the numbers carefully, and I know other people have as well. But we were driven by the numbers. So for me, I wasn't really surprised, but the velocity.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pick up, both you and Al have mentioned that it's the speed of the drop that is surprising people. As Sarah pointed out in our webinar with her a couple of weeks ago, there's really only one question on religion. And Rick, you've already alluded to this, but I might come back to you first this time because I wanted to ask, what more do you want to know? And maybe you've already answered this question, but I'm interested in knowing, you'd like to see a code book and you'd like to see a little bit more from StatsCan, but supposing StatsCan can't provide that or won't provide that. And if you had all the money and time in the world, what more would you like to know about what you saw?
Well, first of all, I think Sarah's right that we're probably not getting another question, but if there was one that we could ask, it would be one about religious participation. And the one that I would want to ask is frequency of participation in worship services. We've asked this on public opinion surveys, and in Canada, weekly religious service participation before the pandemic was down about 11%. During the pandemic, it was down to about 9%. We're doing this working with polling company Maro here in Canada. And that's quite different. That's all religious groups. And we know that there's certainly far more than a plurality more than half Canadians certainly claim a religious affiliation. So it tells a very, very different story if you look at participation. In terms of whether we're surprised based on our own research, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, you would have seen probably about 11% of Canadians identifying as evangelical, whether you're looking at measures of belief and behavior like the Christian Evangelical Scale or just simple affiliation. Today, that's probably down around 7%. So we've seen this sort of decline coming. So we're not surprised that there is a decline. But there's all these methodological problems that go along with people's reticence to identify with an evangelical religious tradition, again, because of the cultural associations largely with what's going on in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Stuart, I'm going to sort of go back around the other way. What more would you like to see? What more would you like to know or ask?
I think there's lots of other things we could ask. What I wanted to stress is the value, as Sarah did, of having one question that goes so long so that we can see change over time. And so I would agree with Rick, though the code books, so we can see what's going on behind the scenes, might also be valuable. I do wonder if there's ways we could do other research, and I know that is being done by people, to ask the kinds of questions that those around the table are asking. The one value of the census, though, is with this continuing imperfect question, we at least see we have a good longitudinal analysis that we can do.
Okay, thank you.
I should just say that those code books were available. I have the code books from 1961, 60, or 71. I've made requests for them since then, but StatCan has never been forthcoming with any kind of detail like they previously had. But I would suspect a lot of it's automated, given that the census is mostly filled out online today. So it should be fairly easy to create a table. But why we don't have that, I don't know.
Okay, Kati, what more should we be asking? What more would you like to know?
Well, if I think of the census data, I think this one single question it's nice that there is at least this one question on religion, and I think it is not necessarily so important that in the census data collection there is too many new questions about religion, because there are so much other data where religion is asked in a more detailed way. So I think this already gives a good overview, and it also helps people to estimate the value of other data if that is representative. So in that sense, I'm really happy that this kind of data as such is available.
Okay. Al, what more would you like to know?
Everything, absolutely everything. You said unlimited resources?
Yes, unlimited resources.
Okay, let's do it. If we're confined to Stats Canada, one thing, it's great to have a census. We don't have to worry about sampling error and so on, not really. So you can, what we're seeing is pretty real. If to add one other question, maybe it is a behaving question. Maybe it's something about belief, because the one thing concerns me is that the no religion category is rather ambiguous and open and maybe misleading. So if we had a question in there that tried to isolate institutionalized or a sense of departing from institutional religion, as opposed to the privatized forms we're all aware of. So I think the question becomes, how much of a drop in terms of Christian thinking and believing are we looking at? So the question to put in there would have something to do with a sense of one's relationship to Christian teaching. If you had one, I think that would be very important. The other thing that's really important, this may be a little aside, but I think looking at agnostics and atheists are critical. And the question here is, are we looking at the same pace of increase that we would with the no religion category? Are they climbing at the same pace or a greater pace, or maybe they are not keeping up? And if they're not keeping up, that makes us rethink a little bit about the stages of decline, a traditional sort of secularization kind of process. Maybe the bottom is not as solid as we think, something like that. Is there any reaction to the loss? And I think that's important to see, if we could.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Of course, substantive religion too. Substantive non-religion is tremendously important. We can't ask that of Stats Canada, I guess. Maybe another time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it gives us some ideas for the things that we might do in terms of areas for exploration. So I appreciate your reflections on that as well. So here's the big question that I'm asking in my research. I know people like Callum Brown have asked it and reflected a bit on the 60s and 70s. And Stuart, certainly you did a bit of reflecting on this in Leaving Christianity. But what explains the decline in religious affiliation and participation, or what we know about it from this latest information that we have? Stuart, do you want to start us off?
So I think when we look over the last 10 years or 20 years, there's some things that could be going on that we might talk about. But I think it is that longer perspective when we zoom out that we really see a break. Yeah, I think the patterns are now very clear. And so something seems to have happened between the 1961 census, the 1971 census. From 71 on, basically the patterns seem to be, and I know there's some variation, but they seem to be set. And so I think the short answer is the 1960s happened. And what do we mean by that? That's where Brown's work and McLeod's work and other work really matters. But I think the Canada that was religious and the Canada that we now have that is more no religious, there's a break between those. I think these are completely different environments. And so that would be why it happened is the bigger question. One of the things that I would suggest that didn't cause it is I don't think it was the government shifted and then people lost identity. I think we begin to see the loss of identity. Oddly enough, the government and culture are still at least somewhat supportive of religion. Governments are never as supportive as religious people want them to be. But I graduated in 1975 from high school. Yes, I am that old. And we still, in Ontario, where I grew up, we still began every day with the Lord's Prayer. And yet we were already moving into a no religious environment. And so I don't think it's the government changed things and then people shifted. And I think so that's the one thing I would just want us to be careful of. In the religious communities, often there's a blaming of government action for what then happens. Sunday hockey, if I had $1 for every time somebody said Sunday hockey was what killed the schools, I would be much wealthier than I am. But I don't, and that's not what the data shows. So,
all right, thank you. I don't believe I've ever heard the Sunday hockey thesis before, so thank you for that. Rick, the big question.
Yeah, I think that belief is really undergirded by a context that kind of holds it. Even a Christian doctrine of revelation is sort of an admission that we wouldn't come to these conclusions unless they were revealed to us. When I was pastoring, I was given a book about the history of the United Churches in the St. Lawrence Valley, and I believe it was about a congregation in Williamsburg. I was really struck. The farmers in the area took up a subscription to pay for the building of the church building, but it was years before they raised enough money to hire a pastor, which tells me that there was a function to having that building, and it was a social gathering function. Now, the social gathering is a very important part of religion. Of course, it's not all of religion, but there is a context that sort of for many years in Canada made Christian beliefs plausible. And I think that has changed. It used to be that the question for us, or the religious question anyway, was how do you deal with the separation between you and God that's caused by sin? I think Taylor is right when he sort of reformulates that. And I'm going to use sort of Christian categories here. Now the question is, how do I connect with my authentic self? And it's my authentic self that is a unique self that I don't know. And you see this sort of expressed in popular culture. You know, you have amnesia as a sort of a common plot device in movies, where the protagonist has forgotten who they are, and the wicked people are there telling them who they are and controlling them. And sort of salvation then becomes learning who you are. And you have a culture now that through movies and other places sort of makes this plausible. And to Stuart's point, you know, why did this happen? I think that in the same way that culturally in the past, we had congregations that were a very important sort of repository of beliefs and plausibility for beliefs. I think we have to pay more attention to where people are now. And I think that things like personal devices that allow you to create identities on social media and stuff like that, make the idea that identity formation and identity discovery is a means to self-actualization. They make that more plausible, and to the extent that you get on these platforms and you develop followings that affirm the identities that you put out there, again, that makes this new religious question more plausible. And conversely, what you have is that you have Christians and other religious groups that come along and say, you must believe this, and there's this common set of doctrine. Well, if my beliefs are a deep part of who I am, and you're telling me it should look like yours, and I look down deep inside and you look like me, then that's just confirmation that I haven't been saved yet, because there's an imposition of identity onto me. And I think that, you know, this is sort of a romantic philosophy sort of informing religious beliefs, and that's not new. But what is new is, I think, that the technologies and the platforms where we gather that support the plausibility of that. And I think that has a lot to do with it. Of course, there's many different reasons, but we see an acceleration of the decline in religion just in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And I think that corresponds with these technologies. Stuart's right that the decline has been happening since the 60s, but the initial decline was around with mainline churches. The declines that we're seeing now have sort of picked up more broadly in the culture.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rick. Al, over to you. Why?
Well, can I give you a little perspective from the dark side? Okay.
Okay.
I'll try to make this fast, but there's something that comes up, and I think this is going to echo the points that have already been made by Rick and Stuart. But when we go back to the role of researchers in the corporate sector, there's about 2,000 working in Canada, and our role has been just to look at transition and needs in terms of products and services. So we're sort of the frontline intelligence to that process. And something happened that we saw, I definitely saw it, lots of others as well, in around the 70s and 80s. And this is going to be after the 60s, but we found in a very consistent way, people were asking for products to be customized, personalized. They wanted recognition of who they were as individuals and so on. And that was just around the time when the expression expressive individualism was starting to surface, even within the dark side, okay? Not within sociology. Certainly it's there, but it looks like it arose separately there. And I think the point that I can bring is that this is something was happening in society and wasn't specific to religion, and religion was caught up in it. And I think that may be a point of view that Stuart might agree with, but it's something that was very substantial and still continuing. So I would say if we have to be pretty sure of something, it would have something to do with individualism And there are many ways of theorizing and describing that, but that has to be part of the core. The rest I'm unsure about. The other thing, just to add, there's a couple of things in terms of mechanisms from sociology that I've picked up that I think there might be a fair amount of consensus on. It's the generation effect. Every succeeding generation enters society with a weaker connection to existing traditional religions. So you do get the generational effect. And also there's what you might call leakage in the transmission across generations and so on. These are more mechanisms. I think what's important is really trying to find more about content. So that would be where I'm at. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I think that's going to be a perfect lead in for Kati, actually. Al, you did that beautifully without, I think, even knowing. Yes. So what I'm hearing so far is really, let's pay attention to cultural context. You can't separate religion from the cultural context and think about it separately. Yep. And then let's think about generational effect. Well, Kati, what would you like to add?
Thank you, Laurie. And it was nice to hear what Rick and Stuart and Al, what you said. Would it be okay if I now showed you a few slides?
Sure.
Yes, because I think they might be helpful here now. Okay, so this, so can you see this now?
Yes.
So this data is from our Transmission of Religion project, that is Templeton-funded project, that we have these 5 countries in the data. And if we look at this data, and Al talked about this generation effect, and if we think of Canada, here is the share of those with no religion across generations. And I think that the share of people with no religion is surprisingly high already among those born in 1940s or earlier. That's already among them, it's almost 30%. And in that sense, I feel that this rise of non-religion is not at all a new thing, but somehow it has become more visible. It has been hiding there for quite a while. And if we compare this line that we see in Canada to that is in western part of Germany or eastern part of Germany, Finland, Hungary, or Italy, in general, the share of share of those with no religion is higher only in eastern part of Germany in all age groups. So. And among the young ones, the Canadians seems to be almost like the East Germans. They are so much with no religion. So there is also a high increase, but also it's important to point out that the share of those with no religion is also really, really high among those born in 40s or 50s. So in that sense, this increase is not at all new. And secondly, if we look at this situation in Canada, not only from the perspective of no religion, what is happening to them, but what is happening to those various religious groups. Roman Catholics, they are declining, but not as fast as the mainline Protestants. They are declining really, really fast. And the share of mainline Protestants is extremely low among the young generation born in 1980s and 1990s. That's around 5%. So it seems that mainland Protestants are really, really disappearing from Canada in the near future. And the other Christians, they are not so much increasing. They are more or less staying the same. There is slight increase, but not too much of increase. And the same with non-Christian groups. They are increasing a little bit, but not as much as the other ones are declining. And here is the increase of non-religious ones, of religious nuns, as we saw earlier. And what's also visible in Canada, if we look at that issue of what is the religion that you were raised in, And we look at that change, and here we see the Catholic situation, how many was raised as Catholic. There is not so much change, but if we look at the people who have been raised as mainline Protestants, this decline already sort of took place in the families. So it's not only the people themselves, but it was the families, the mainline Protestant families who sort of stopped raising their children, religious ones. So in that sense, it seems that the increase in non-religion in Canada is very much a family thing, that mainline Protestant families do not raise their children religious any longer. Here are the other Christian, how many have been raised other Christian or non-Christian, or how many have been raised none. You can see that it was fairly low, but among the young ones, about 25% have already been raised as nuns, or those born in 1980s or 1990s. So it is actually fairly high among those already there. And here are the figures of those with no religion from the 5 countries that we have in the data. In general, you see that the figure from Canada, that is the TORAC data, 39%. It is the second highest. Only in eastern part of Germany, the share of no religion people is higher. And what we also see in our data when we look at Canada is that if we compare the respondents' religiousness to the religion of their parents, we see that in Canada, there is both among women and men, the highest number of those who are less religious than their parents. And this is what Al referred to in his talk, that there is this sort of decline after each successive generation. But it seems that it's even higher in Canada, that the next generation is less religious than the previous one, and even greater among women than among men. This is the share of those who are the same. So I would primarily sort of highlight that this is strongly a family thing, and also something that is not at all new. It has been there for quite a while, but it has been hiding.
Can I just make a comment about what Kati presented? You know, we're talking about Caucasian majority countries here, and in the rest of the world, you know, religious belief of various kinds is growing, and certainly in the other religious categories, you noted that in Canada, it's increasing, especially a little bit, especially among younger people. The vibrant communities, both within evangelical communities and within the Catholic communities, are among immigrants, those people that come from outside of a Caucasian majority context. And that's changing the face of evangelicalism in Canada, that it's becoming increasingly non-Caucasian. And I think that that's the true as well for Catholics. If you talk to Catholics about where their really vibrant dioceses are, it will be where they have the most immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Loss of religion is largely a Caucasian phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks, Rick, for that observation, and thank you, Kati, for that. It's really nice to see some insights from the study that you're involved in with Crystal, that's based actually here in Germany. The not new piece is interesting too, because again, Stuart, you really, I think, suggested that in Leaving Christianity, and it was the book was really interesting to me for all kinds of reasons, but that was one of the reasons, because it had been, you know, it took a long time for the sociology to catch up and the history to catch up with what was actually happening.
The graph that I think has become increasingly important the last little while in the book, we had way too many. Well, the one was comparing what should have been if all the kids who had come to the United Church and been baptized had actually made a profession of faith versus what was. And the gap between that just explains a lot of what we've just seen. So thanks to Kati, and that we're hearing from others. So I agree. There was a failure within families, within structures to pass that religious identity, faith on. And that happened in the 1960s. And then we've just seen the rolling out of that. I would just ask when you look at the demographics of the United Church in the last census, exactly what we were, so far it only reinforced they're older and older and older. And yet remember, they were the same age as Canadians in the 1960s. They matched the overall age profile. They're now much older.
We have in the chat box a couple of questions, and rather than me ask another question, I'd like to turn to those because, give someone else a chance to ask a question. I think that's a good idea. One is from an anonymous attendee who asks, what was the question asked of respondents in Kati's study that led to the response, no religion?
Well, thank you for this question. Well, we had plenty of different kinds of questions. This was very much in the end of our survey. We had earlier asked them if any, what is the religion that you have been raised to, if any, or something like that. I don't exactly know the wording, but this was and then we asked about their parents' religiousness, what they did at home. Did you have evening prayer? Did you have did you go to church, or did you? But later in the survey, this was almost one of the very last questions. We asked them, what is your religion, if any? What is your religion today, if any? And that was the question what I presented, the religiousness issue. And the other one was what was the religion that, if any, that you were raised to when you were a child?
Thank you. Another question. This might suggest a little bit about where this was hiding, to use Kati's words. An interesting question from Gregory Bloomquist, who writes, in the late 30s, my father was in the British Army. He was asked on entry, religion? He answered, none. He was told, fine, put him down as C of E. How would he have appeared in a census then, as opposed to now, had he been asked the same question? So it's a really interesting question, which raises some other questions about who's filled out census data, who's answered the question, when, under what circumstances, and so on. But again, does anyone want to respond to that directly?
Well, I've done some looking at how the censuses were coded, and in the 1940s, after the Union of the United Church in 1925, there was a sense that the churches were going to keep uniting, and that sort of was carried over into how they coded the census. So there were a lot of Methodist groups that got counted as United Church. And there were other groups that were, a lot of the smaller evangelical groups suddenly were counted in with some of the larger mainline groups. So their numbers were inflated and evangelical groups disappeared. So some of our understanding of where religion goes in the census has to do with how well people at StatCan understand religion. And it's very, very uneven. Like, for example, the Christian Reformed Church, I think in the 1960s or 1970s, 71 census, they had 60 or 70,000 people, but there were smaller, but they were put in the other category, whereas groups that had like 14,000, like Free Methodists, because they had a sort of a recognized sort of moniker, they were listed in common census documents. And so it's been very uneven, and I would suspect that there's a lot of new Canadian denominations like Jesus is Lord or the Redeemed Christian Church of God that don't get recognized at all on the census.
Thanks, Rick. Kati, you want to jump in?
Well, I would like to comment. Al pointed out that issue that within the no religion group, there are different kinds of people and with different kinds, perhaps different kinds of beliefs. And also we see in our data that about 1/3 of those with no religion, they are sort of believers, and also that share is slightly higher in Canada than in our data as a whole. So that there are obviously people with beliefs, and also there is a certain number of those who even say that there is one God, and not just life spirit kind of beliefs, but really this kind of personal God kind of beliefs.
And the word religion is kind of a poison term in our culture as well. And so I think there'd be a lot of people that would shy away just from the term. And, it's great to have a longitudinal question for comparability, but as the culture changes, we may not be measuring the same thing anymore just because of how the culture understands the words.
Yeah, one other point as a researcher that occurs to me in looking at the Stats Canada question, just very quickly. One individual, probably mother, maybe father, filling out for all family members. When it comes to folks 18 to 24 still at home, how would they be caught? What are they sent with? It's based on the parental perspective. That's just the time of life when things are changing. People are young adults are emerging with different views, which they're not going to discuss with their parents. So one wonders about that. And I agree, Rick, somehow that the main question has functioned for years and years, but it was composed at a very different time. And so certainly Stats Canada, if they can, should take another look, in my opinion. So.
Stuart, you want to respond to that?
I don't mind taking another look. I just think we need to be careful. The other thing is, when we ask questions of belief, we ask them now, but we imagine religious belief in the past. Did people have religious identities but still not believe in God? When I'm trying to answer that question, I sometimes read novels. And Elmer Gantry is an example of a book where they talk about that and other things. So I think my only concern is we have this imperfect question, but it's identity. And as long as we recognize what we're measuring, I also think Rick's point, and he's done great work on this, is how the mainline denominations, all the Protestants were stuck with them. Gave them an inflated sense of their importance and the culture. Well, that's also a cultural value. So sometimes when we ask good questions about this and look at the data, we also get what the cultural values are. And there was a bias against evangelical churches in Canada in the 1960s. And I completely accept that.
Interesting.
Thank you. So I have another question. I actually have a couple of other questions, but we have about 10 minutes left, maybe a teensy bit less, to give Emma a chance to do the final minutes of housekeeping. We don't have any more questions in the chat, and I'm happy to receive more if people have a question. But I'm going to just do a quick round then and ask you, what next? So, Stuart, do you want to pull out your crystal ball again? I know you said it was Brian's crystal ball, but do you want to maybe predict where we're headed? What will we see on the next census?
Well, no, I don't want to predict. But I think what the numbers seem to show is that some of these trends are ingrained, and I think we will see no religion increase. I think the traditional historic churches, the mainstream churches, their demographics in this census look awful. So they're going to be smaller. I think the one category we're not clear on is just those people who told the census they're Christian, and I hope somebody will do work on that. But I think the trends are pretty strong, and I'm not sure I see anything that would break them.
Okay, so you're not predicting where the bottom is. Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme has in the comments, loss of Christian majority in Canada by 2031, probably only in a few years.
I would add to what Sarah says, and think we've probably lost that already. It's just probably not showing up in the census numbers yet.
Yeah. Al?
Couple of thoughts. One may be that could we look to Britain for a sense of where we're going to be in a decade or so? Just a thought that there's certainly greater polarization developing, maybe. Related to that, and I'm just throwing out some hypotheses, but one of these that strikes me is a continued move towards more liberalized value systems. And why can you say that? Well, those with no religion are younger, and those who are younger have more liberal value systems. We pretty well know that. And so that should take us into the future a little bit. It's and coupled with that would be some possible polarization that comes out of that. And I'm not sure, but the question I would have is that for those in or with established religion, with traditional faith, are you as a group becoming more liberal, or are you retrenching a little bit? What's your perspective on that? Are you becoming sort of increasingly conservative? Is that something you can answer? But I think it's an important question.
Thanks, Al. Rick?
Well, I think, trends always, a trend is just if things keep going the way that they're going, this is what's going to happen. I think, COVID has taught us, like only a few clever epidemiologists saw COVID coming. The rest of us, we had other thoughts about what the future held for us. I think, where religion goes to a large extent depends on the culture, the repository that makes different ideas plausible. There's other parts of the world where expressive individualism is just not a plausible belief system, because you have more collective cultures where this just wouldn't fly. And, we are a very wealthy culture. We're a culture that has a lot of the technological platforms that make the idea that we can express ourselves and have identities and profitably live our lives that way. That exists today. There may come a context where that kind of context does not support that way of thinking, and we don't know when and how the world is going to change.
Okay.
Thanks, Rick. Kati, where are we headed?
Well, I'm more into looking backwards, and it just came to my mind that I don't know if you have that in Canada or have had that in Canada as well, but if I remember in Finland, when we as researchers already 20 years ago, when we presented these kind of research results that church will be declining and religion will be declining, we strongly felt that the churches were really sort of closing our mouths, that you should not talk about that. You are causing people to leave the church because you are keeping it in discussion, and you should not talk about leaving the church. And they were sort of too satisfied in that situation that things are good enough, and that kind of talk just causes problems. And so it wasn't until the decline was so heavy that the churches sort of opened their eyes to see that, oh, it is really happening. And I don't know if you have had that in Finland. I had bishops calling me that you should not talk about these issues publicly, about leaving the church or things like that, and that we should only talk about positive things related to the church. So so that there needs to be enough changes that the churches really open their eyes that these things are really happening.
Thanks, Kati. That was a good forward-looking, backward-looking comment. I mean, just to close, I'll take host's prerogative and say that I'm really interested in what people do care about. And so we're focusing on maybe a loss in some senses, but I think what engaging with what people do care about is important. I'm a little bit more of a skeptic about the whole individualism explanation. I think that sometimes we lean a bit too heavily on that. I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant, but I think maybe we need to consider the ways in which people are connected, forming new kinds of communities, the things that they do care about. Where is their collective engagement? But I think, again, in their book, Brian and Stuart raise an important question, and that is, if there are social consequences that are negative for this decline, what are some ways we can ameliorate them? So in other words, if there are functions that the churches have served in providing social support or contributing to the social support network, and I think indeed they have, then how do we address that? How do we perhaps address those gaps? How do we think about what the gaps are a little bit more carefully? And certainly in Leaving Christianity, you suggest that, and I think you're right to raise that as a concern. How do we think about charitable giving? How do we think about volunteering? And I know Sarah and Joel have done some work on this. I've heard a paper that they've presented, and I think we have to be proactive and think, okay, where do we address these things? But also, how do people, this is always my big question, is certainly the question of the NCF, which is, how do we live well together? How do we figure out ways to get along when people are, and this goes out, I think, to your point, which is, where are those points of tension that are potentially so divisive that we create a kind of perhaps toxic environment in our society? So asking those questions are really important. And you've engaged with this very generously. I really appreciate your coming today to reflect on what's happening, to think about it. I appreciate your caution in predicting the future. I think it's probably unwise for us to do that because then, Rick, as you point out, we are surprised by things like the pandemic. So I guess that's probably where I'll wrap us up on this. Again, with a final thank you to each of you for being so incredibly generous with your time and your comments and your engagement. And I think, Emma, you wanted to do a little bit of a wrap up and maybe advertise some of our upcoming events as well.
Sounds great. Thank you, Lori. So yeah, thank you again to all of our panelists. This was such an engaging discussion. It was a great follow-up to our event the other week. I'd also like to thank all our attendees for joining us today. If you're interested in attending our future events, I've linked our website in the chat below. I also have linked to tomorrow's event. So we have a Meet the Author event tomorrow at the same time at 12 p.m. Eastern. The registration link for that is in the chat as well. So we hope to see you there. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.